Okay, folks, I'm pretty good at following instructions. The Vice just told me to make it real short. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to introduce to you the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General Pete Chiarelli.
Whoa, it's great to be here. I'm out of the Pentagon, but not for long. And good afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction, that very short introduction. I appreciate it, sir. It's great to join all of you down here in sunny Florida. It's not like this in Washington, D.C., as I know many of you know. I'm usually stuck in my office doing these things by VTC, and just getting out of the plane today was a pleasure compared to the weather we've got in D.C. Now, I recognize that I'm not the first choice to speak today. I am the second choice, and I am okay with that. I am okay with being option B. Now, I see some of you looking around the room trying to figure out who the first choice was. It wasn't the Chief, General Casey. He's speaking later this week. It wasn't General Dempsey. He's taking a short break from study for his confirmation hearings to be here today, and he'll speak tomorrow morning. What I'm told is the first choice was IBM's Watson. Fresh from the supercomputer's win on Jeopardy last week. Unfortunately, Watson was unavailable, and so I got the call from General Sullivan asking me to fill in, and I was happy to do so. Now, for those of you who watch Hollywood Access and are following the trials and tribulations of Miss Lohan and don't watch Jeopardy, Watson is a supercomputer created by IBM that took on Jeopardy's all-time champions Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter and, politely stated, waxed them. At one point, Watson answered 6 questions correctly in a row. Nevertheless, when he missed, he really missed. During the second round, Watson completely blew Final Jeopardy. When asked to name a U.S. city whose 2 largest airports were named for a World War II hero in a World War II battle, Watson answered Toronto. Seems like some of the people we work with every once in a while, right, Dr. O'Neill? Okay, let's get a little serious here. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. Warfare as we know it has changed forever, and I honestly believe that, and I know a lot of people argue with me about that, and they say it's really not warfare that's changed. We no longer fight national armies on linear battlefields. There's no forward edge of the battlefield or FIBA. Simply stated, it is and will remain a combination of kinetic and non-kinetic effects, and our soldiers are asked to fight along the full continuum, transitioning back and forth, often in a matter of hours or even minutes. The fact remains, in the operational environments we find ourselves in today, it is usually the Army's non-commissioned officers and enlisted soldiers who are on the ground dealing with situations that arise. They are the sources of game-changing decisions on today's battlefield. And as United States Marine Corps General Chuck Krulak coined the term strategic corporal to reflect this new reality. Now, I will readily admit, especially for us old guys, change isn't always easy. I remember as a young tanker being taught to avoid major cities and large urban areas at all costs. Yet when I was given the mission to take the 1st Cavalry Division into Iraq in 2004, I was told to go ahead and put an entire division, the heaviest division in the United States Army, inside a city of about 7.5 million people, 276 square miles, about the size of Chicago, with not one working traffic light. However, as my good friend and mentor, General Eric Shinseki, used to say, if you don't like change, you're going to hate being irrelevant. That sage advice has certainly rung true over the past decade of war, and I'll give you a couple of great examples. You've all undoubtedly heard me talk about the flow of information. In the past, information and decision-making resided almost totally in senior levels of command. Envision a pyramid. Information was pushed down to subordinate leaders on an as-needed basis in the form of operations orders and command directives. This is no longer the case. The pyramid is now inverted. The majority of information is collected by soldiers at the unit level, the same guys and gals making the majority of the game-changing decisions. And we've had to figure out how to accommodate this change. That was the genesis, quite frankly, for the network. We realized we needed to figure out a way to provide leaders and soldiers ready access to significantly more information than in past wars. And while I'm truly excited to see the network grow and expand, in fact, we're getting ready to release Increment 2 next week, and this is going to enable us to put even more information in the hands of the soldiers. The truth is, the surge we're seeing in new technologies does represent a double-edged sword. Consider the impact of the release of confidential documents on WikiLeaks. While we benefit greatly from increased access to information, our enemies have enjoyed a significant advantage, in part due to the robust cell phone and internet infrastructure. Over the past decade, it's enabled them to rapidly employ relatively cheap technologies in new and innovative ways. The reality is every soldier we employ and every savvy terrorist we encounter has a cell phone or some kind of smartphone capable of taking pictures or videos that then can be transmitted halfway around the world in a matter of seconds. The presence of media and social media has literally transformed the battlefield, creating what General Dempsey has described as, and I quote, a much more transparent, complex, and decentralized operational environment. Again, this only serves to confirm for me the small unit, the squad and platoon, has become the decisive element of our formations. And as General Krulak also pointed out, the young soldiers who make up those small units, operating under the constant eye of the media, are asked to exercise a tremendous, unprecedented degree of maturity, restraint, and judgment. And they are doing an absolutely remarkable job. The reality is the Army's success in the future requires us to empower our leaders and soldiers at the small unit level. I know Dr. Malcolm O'Neill talked to you this morning about the great efforts underway within the acquisition, logistics, and technology community to provide soldiers a decisive advantage by reinforcing on their needs and providing the tools and capabilities to do their job individually and as part of tactical small units. Instead of attaching things to soldiers, they are designing systems around the soldier. This represents significant progress. We must continue to work together to get needed capability into the hands of our warfighters. That said, as I alluded to earlier, there are second and third order effects whenever you field a new capability, especially one that serves to increase the amount of data available on today's battlefield. On the one hand, the quantity and quality of information available to today's decision makers is remarkable. But it does also mean we have a responsibility to train individuals accordingly. And not just on simple skills or mechanical tasks, but even more importantly, how to handle and analyze the vast amounts of information and data they're receiving and employ technologies effectively in the very dynamic environments we find ourselves in today. As General Dempsey says, the challenge is figuring out how best to produce and reward leaders who are inquisitive, creative, and adaptable. I know he will cover the topic in much greater detail tomorrow, but I did want to briefly provide a few thoughts on the subject from my experiences over the past 38 years. One of our Army's greatest leaders and a fellow tanker, General George S. Patton, strongly believed that it was not the Army's business to dig in and defend territory. And he meant that literally and figuratively. To the contrary, the Army, he said, was going to move and move fast. General Patton's message was that we must always be adaptable. We must be prepared for the unexpected. Let's face it, the United States Army has been trying to predict the future for 235 plus years, and we've not been successful yet. In fact, I carry a chart around in my notebook. I call it the failed assumptions chart. It lists all the assumptions made by senior leaders since the start of this war. Nearly every one of them has proven untrue. Unless you're a psychic or a mind reader, you cannot know what the future holds. And to attempt to train for every possible scenario or contingency is futile, if not foolish. The reality is leaders who try to train at everything end up captured by a training matrix, ultimately training to time, not to standard. And soldiers in these units end up not excelling at anything. They're unable to achieve a lasting level of proficiency that they can reach back to in a challenging situation. As General Dempsey has said, the goal should be to prepare our leaders by replicating the complexity of the operational environment. And I believe you do that by helping individuals to gain confidence in a small number of core competencies that they can then practice over and over using a wide variety of different real-world scenarios with changing conditions until every soldier is an expert at them. Simply stated, in the complex and dynamic environments we find ourselves in today, we want our soldiers to be proficient at proficiency. Some of you may have heard me tell the story before, but when I was a Battalion S3 of 4-8 Cav back in 1987, we competed in the World Series of Tank Gunnery in Grafenwehr, Germany. It was called the Canadian Cup. We had a company do nothing but tank gunnery for 18 months. And during that time, because their medal was simple, hit 32 targets with no more than 40 rounds of ammunition, using as few rounds as possible, but no more than 40, they became experts at every supporting task. If they missed in practice, we would literally pull them off the tank range, and they'd go back and train on that specific task over and over and over again on a UCOV. Then they would go back out on the range and fire the exact engagement that they missed. As a result, soldiers had absolute total confidence in their NCOs. The NCOs trusted their officers, all trusted that each knew what right looked like, regardless of the task. And they understood that no one on the team would accept anything less. This team won the Canadian Army Trophy, the first United States Army team to win this prestigious competition. Being a member of that team was part of the victory, and it was amazing. Yet I learned the greatest lesson from what happened next. The outgoing brigade commander had previously agreed to excuse the winning company from participating in an upcoming Hohenfeld's rotation. It was going to be 30 days after we returned. He promised us we wouldn't go. We changed command. The new guy came in and said, what? You're going to Hohenfeld's. He wanted to get this thing as far behind him as he possibly could. Now, these guys had not trained on any other skills for 18 months except tank gunnery. But they trusted their non-commissioned officers. They had great confidence in their abilities, and they immediately went and signed out protective masks and individual weapons and got to work. It was marvelous to see them on the basketball court, literally going through formations and how they would attack and how they would defend and how they would go into a hasty defense. 30 days later, they carried the battalion and the brigade through that rotation. That was the most important lesson. Their ability to do that. Pure trust of soldiers in their non-commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers in their officers. The challenge looking ahead is, how do we continue to effectively train and prepare soldiers to manage and analyze the vast amount of data and information available on today's battlefield? Employ the various tools and technologies at their disposal in order to make the critical decisions that will have the desired tactical and strategic consequences. I believe we're on the right path, and that General Dempsey and TRADOC deserve much of the credit. Their training brain is a great example of a tool that's enabling soldiers to conduct challenging, realistic, and relevant training both at home station and well deployed. And that's the key point. A soldier's ability to conduct realistic training back home is critical. The reality is the network cannot and should not be just a tactical asset employed in combat environments. It must also encompass networks at CONUS installations and training centers, in brigade and battalion classrooms at home stations and schoolhouses. The intent is to provide all soldiers with the ability to get whatever information they need anytime, anywhere in the world. And we're getting there with the CIO G6's Global Network Enterprise Construct, or GNEC, the strategy for transitioning Land War Net from many loosely affiliated independent networks into a truly global capability that is designed, deployed, and managed as a single integrated enterprise. Now, before I take your questions, I'd like to talk very briefly about one other area I believe training is proving absolutely critical to our success. As many of you know, I am focused on the health and well-being of our force, and in particular the well-being of those individuals suffering from what I consider to be the signature wounds of this war, namely post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. The fact remains, these wounds are not well understood, yet they affect a significant portion of the Army's wounded warrior population, 64% as of 1 February 2001. That's a population of now over 9,000 folks. 64% have post-traumatic stress or TBI. 64%. And they're all with a single disqualifying injury of 30% or greater. Now, I'm certain many of you have heard me talk at length about the complexity of these injuries and how absolutely important it is that we do everything we possibly can to assist soldiers and their families dealing with them, now and in the future. The reality is we continue to draw down operations in Iraq, and eventually in Afghanistan, we're going to see more and more soldiers return home, many of them dealing with post-traumatic stress, TBI, depression, anxiety, and other behavioral health conditions. Unfortunately, in recent years, we've also seen the stress and strain on our force manifested in an increased number of high-risk deaths, suicide attempts, and suicides. I would tell you, and General Sullivan and I talked about this before, you can't ask a force to do what you've asked this force to do for the last 10 years and not expect to see those second and third order effects. And that's exactly what they are. We have got to increase the bog-dwell ratio. We've got to get these kids more time at home if we're going to see these things decrease in any great numbers. The great news is that we now have empirical data to support our belief that increased resiliency helps individuals to deal more effectively with stress. Couple that with the fact that you can teach resiliency, and we've got ourselves some very exciting news. I'm extremely encouraged to see the efforts underway to help improve soldiers' resiliency across our force. Most notable among them is the Chief's Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program, and I call it the Chief's because he has truly been the champion of it. He's pushed us all toward it, and we now have the empirical data to show how absolutely critical it is. And that program includes the global assessment tool. It includes our master resiliency trainers and our online modules used to train resiliency. The reality is that any individual, if you put more and more stressors on them, they will eventually reach the brink. Our goal, the objective of the Army's efforts to increase soldiers and individuals' resiliency, is to help them move as far to the left as possible, away from the edge. I truly believe that our efforts to train soldiers on resiliency is just as important, if not more so, than is training them on the basic tactical and soldier skills required on the battlefield. We can't do one at the expense of the other. We must do all of them. Our overall vision, as our Chief, General Casey, stated, is an Army that is a versatile mix of tailorable and networked organizations operating on a rotational cycle to provide a sustained flow of trained and ready forces for full spectrum operations and to hedge against unexpected contingencies at a tempo that is predictable and sustainable for the all-volunteer force. All this is achievable with the right mix of force structure and capability, but it is ultimately dependent upon the ability, the versatility and adaptability of our people. As the theme of this conference states, that represents our competitive advantage. Now, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have for me, but first, I want to show you a truly remarkable video I saw for the first time this past weekend. Some of you may have seen this before. Stephen Wiltshire is a savant, often referred to as the living camera. He's taken up for a 45-minute helicopter ride over Rome, the first time he'd ever seen the city. Then, over a period of 3 days, he drew the panoramic view from memory with incredible accuracy. It's a great reminder that in spite of all the technologies that exist or will exist in the future, the most amazing, complex tool we have is the human brain. Looking ahead, we must continue to find ways to harness the tremendous power of the brain and help individuals to utilize the remarkable supercomputer encased inside our heads. Could you please run the video?
Stephen Wiltshire from London is a star among savants. His nickname is the living camera. Stephen is autistic. He lives in a world of his own. Communication is difficult for him. He didn't speak his first words, pencil and paper, until he was 5. Yet when he was 11, he drew a perfect aerial view of London after only one helicopter ride. For this film, we're testing the living camera in Rome. Stephen has never seen the eternal city from above before. After only a 45-minute helicopter flight, we'll ask him to draw a 5.5-yard panoramic picture of the historic city centre, without having a second glance at it. Stephen has 3 days. 5.5 yards of paper can look scarily empty. The amazing thing, Stephen starts the drawing as we would, with the Church of St. Peter's. But he doesn't do any sketches, nor roughing out of the space for the drawing. It's as if the panorama already existed within his head, with all the proportions, all the roads, all the details. A little miracle. At the end of the second day, Stephen is a good halfway through his creation. After 3 days of his drawing marathon, even Stephen Wiltshire starts to tire. He has filled in more than 5 yards of paper in fine pencil. He has been restlessly aligning window to window and house to house. We started to compare the accuracy of the drawing with the real thing. Is Stephen's version of St. Peter's cupola too dominant? Stephen is frighteningly right. And, despite our doubts, Stephen has drawn one of the most complex buildings, the Colosseum, so precisely, it's practically a blueprint of reality. Stephen was also accurate in the instances we checked of nameless buildings and side streets. Had he had more time, his sister Annette believes, he would have put in even more detail.
Take that, Watson. If you get a chance, go online and take a look at this thing. It's really 5.5 minutes long, and they do a complete comparison. And this kid, not only did he draw the big, well-known landmarks almost perfectly, but every side street, the number of windows on all the buildings, they compared them and could find hardly any mistakes whatsoever. 45 minutes in a helicopter over Rome for the first time. In fact, they questioned whether he'd gotten the Roman hills wrong because they thought they were much more dominant terrain features in Rome. But then they went up to the same altitude he was flying at, and quite frankly, they looked exactly like he had drawn them. And absolutely an amazing example of this super world, his superhuman computer. Fantastic stuff. Okay. I will go ahead and answer any questions you might have. I have to ask myself the questions. How does mastery of a few core competencies fit into full spectrum training? Are they at odds with each other? And I would argue they're absolutely not. You know, this isn't the first time, and that's the problem with 38 years. You've lived through this many, many times. But there was a time in the 90s that we really thought that we would be doing operations at a level that was going to require forces at all levels to be able to fight what we used to call LIC, low-intensity conflict. And there was a tendency for heavy units to go out and to try to do all the heavy unit tasks that they had to do, along with all the LIC tasks that they had to do. And that's when I really kind of glommed onto this idea. And, you know, General Vono was the first one who did it. He did it with metal. But we didn't have a lot of discipline, and metal became, I believe, became a concept that we abandoned in a period in our Army. I'm really trying to argue that we need to get back to that. We need to find what those critical tasks are, the most difficult ones, and understand that we can't possibly predict what the next fight is going to be like. And I really believe that that's what leaders need to do. That to do anything else, you become an absolute captive to a training matrix that says you only have X amount of time at a certain location, and whether or not you've reached the level of proficiency or not, you must move on to the next one to master the next skill, and you end up mastering no skills at all. I think we have to leave it up to commanders to make a determination on what those are based on what they believe would be the most difficult mission for their formation to carry out. Now, there's ways that you can integrate secondary tasks into any training that you do to ensure that you broaden that skill set. But the key, I believe, critical thing is that you limit it so that what you train to proficiency. So that, as I indicated in my example, soldiers have confidence that their sergeants know what right looks like, and sergeants have confidence that their leaders know what right looks like. You're only kidding yourself if you think you can tell them you're proficient at something when they know they're not proficient at it. Okay, thank you for talking about training our force. I would propose an observation that over the last 10 years that we have accepted too much risk in the training peg as we have increased the fielding of new equipment in the equipping peg. The consequences are significant as we are now behind not only in training resources, but in capturing the techniques of how this new generation learns and responds to training. Would appreciate your comments and thoughts on whether this is an issue from your perspective. I honestly believe we've got the best trained force that we've ever had today, that we have, in fact, trained it to a level of proficiency that is unparalleled. You know, a lot of people, when we published the report on health promotion, risk reduction, and suicide prevention, read Chapter 3. And when they saw some of the issues that we talked about, when we talked about the lost art of garrison leadership, they said, well, why aren't you holding those individuals responsible? I really believe that our commanders have done exactly what they need to do, given the short amount of time they have had between deployments. They have prioritized the list of things that they need to do to ensure, and I go back to something General Shinseki used to say, no soldier goes into harm's way untrained. And in doing that, some of the things that we used to do fell off the plate. And there were second and third order effects with that, that's for sure. We're trying to recapture those now. We're moving them back into the schoolhouse to make sure that the leader of today understands some of those key and critical skills that are absolutely necessary to leadership not only on the battlefield, but leadership in garrison. I believe the chief is moving us in the right way in ensuring that we have full spectrum rotations and begin the process of having full spectrum rotations, that we get back many of the skills that we had as we move into a more force-on-force, kinetic, direct fire kinds of engagements. Those engagements are on the battlefield today. They just don't, the duration of them just isn't as long as many of us trained for when we were training in the Cold War days and afterwards. So I'm a kind of a glass half full person here. I think there is probably some work that we need to do, particularly in the area of simulations and simulators, to capture some of the technological advantages that we have today that are not as up to date as they need to be. I think we could find great efficiencies if we were to do that and bring them into our training kit bag. But I don't think we are in that bad a shape. We've seen how social and mobile networks can empower individuals to act as groups. Recently in Egypt. If you give the soldier this type of capability, will you empower them with the trust required for effective mission command? Because the proposed network will give them the opportunity to act. I think that's just an absolute necessity, and that's really what I'm trying to say here today. I think not only do we have to give soldiers the tools, but we have to teach soldiers as best we can how to use those tools. And quite frankly, they will teach themselves how to best use those tools. We've got to give them left and right limits to make sure that they do it correctly and set them up for success. One of the things we're trying to do is work our way through the differences that the different services have between Type 1 and Type 2 encryption. I think it's fair to say that the Army feels much more of the information that is found on the tactical edge can be passed over Type 2 encryption, whereas other services believe that it all needs to be over Type 1 encryption. Some services have policies that basically do not provide clearances to individuals except when they get onto the battlefield, and they give them battlefield clearances. We've all, of us who have been downrange, have been in a situation where a FBCB2 is prominent in a vehicle with only one person looking at what is classified as a secret screen that shows the location of friendlies. I really believe that we need to look hard at this. We need to look, if for no other reason, because of the cost of what it causes, if we deny that information to soldiers because of security levels. I'm for pushing as much as we can down, using Type 2 encryption, so that we allow the soldier, every soldier in a squad that's shot at by a sniper, to get the read off of the boomerang that tells them where that shot came from. Whereas there's some that would deny that to everyone except for select members in a squad. That's not how I feel. But I really believe that if we set soldiers up for success in this area, we will have success, that this is exactly what we need to do. And denying that information will only cause them to make those same decisions without the value of seeing the entire picture. And that is all three of the cards that I have. I find this extremely difficult to read my own questions, but I will continue to do it. No, that's fine. I'll go ahead and do it. I usually take a breath, but that's fine. Chiarelli, given the impending budget reductions, how is the Army going to avoid becoming a hollow force, specifically in the material area? This is the one that keeps us awake at night right now. There's two ways we can do this, and we've kind of looked back historically. The Army has always protected end strength. We have always, I think, many times to a fault, done everything we can to protect end strength, and we have gone ahead and robbed equipment accounts. And I really believe that the chief feels very, very strongly that balance means more than just bog dwell. Balance means make sure we have a balanced force. Now, I happen to believe that there are certain folks who feel that the Army's end strength should be such, and that if we were to protect end strength at the cost of equipment accounts, in the end, we'd end up with a much smaller Army poorly equipped. I believe that we've got to have a balance in our equipment counts and our personnel counts to make sure that we have the Army that we need but that Army must be well equipped. I know there is a lot of concern, but I take great heart in the fact that the Secretary laid out three assumptions. And I already talked about assumptions. Those assumptions were we're out of Iraq, we see a significant drawdown coming out of Afghanistan from now through 14, and that there is no additional contingency requiring large numbers of ground forces. And I would add a fourth, and that fourth is that we have the ready access we need to the reserve components. We absolutely have to have an operationalized reserve, and that to me means that we can get at them at 1 to 4, 1 to 5. 1 year deployed, mobilized, 4 to 5 years back at home. That is an absolute requirement. If all those assumptions prove to be correct, I think it is prudent at this time to do the planning, and the Chief calls it reversible planning, and I like that term, to take the force down to 520. 520 will still be 47,000 more soldiers when you add in the 9,000 reserve component soldiers into that total, additional ones that we have today. That'll be 47,000 more soldiers than we had at the beginning of this. At the same time, my concern is getting bogged well to 1 to 2, beginning in 12, and eventually to 1 to 3. And I believe it needs to be 1 to 3 with 9 months deployed, 27 months at home, at a minimum. That is something that we have just got to get to, and we need to ensure that people understand that if they violate that and give us less than that, there are second and third order effects, and those are the second and third order effects that we feel today. But I really believe we have to ensure that the force is balanced, that equipment and personnel accounts are balanced. Now, on personnel, we've got to look at ways to stop the increase in the cost of individuals. Currently, personnel are increasing at about 1.4% a year. 1.4% a year is very, very significant. And the problem we have, I saw the greatest chart the other day to explain how we're viewed by Department of Defense. It was just a simple PowerPoint chart of a rheostat. And it said is the Army, an Army force structure, is a rheostat for DOD. Because it's math that even a guy who only taught his kids long division could do. 10,000 soldiers is $1 billion a year. And when you take out 10,000 soldiers, you're looking at $1 billion from the year you take them out, every succeeding POM year. If you take out 20,000 soldiers, even I can figure that out. That's $2 billion a year. Across the POM, that's $10 billion. And you can go on from there. And that's the issue. But we have got to find a way to stop our personnel accounts from getting as expensive or continuing to be as expensive as they are today. We've got to find a way to kind of level this thing off. Given the situation in the Middle East, what is the Army's position on force structure cut? Is this the time to accept that? I think our position is, as I indicated, the Chief calls it reversible planning. We know that force structure cut is going to take place. Now, we are at 570 right now. We have 22,000 in TESI. TESI is temporary end strength increase. The temporary end strength increase we said all along was temporary. We will begin taking that down over an 18-month period in the middle of 12. That is all enlisted soldiers. It is not officers. It is all enlisted soldiers. It's not a whole bunch of soldiers that are going around with a scarlet T on their chest, that we're not going out and taking the ones we brought in the temporary end strength increase. So it will be soldiers. Some of it will be done through attritions. Some of it will be done through quality points. But over an 18-month period, we'll take the force from 569 down to 547.4. We are asked to start planning now to take 27,000 folks out of the force structure from 547.4 down to 524 in 15 and 16. And Tom Bostic now is doing the mission analysis to make sure we do that right. And that might mean that we don't, because we want to do everything we can to help our people and ensure that when we bring that force down, it is a balanced force. I won't put words in General Sullivan's mouth, but I think it's fair to say that in other times we've had to take the force down so quickly. When it was all over, because we had numbers we had to reach, we ended up with a force that was out of balance. We had more of some MOSs than we had of other MOSs, and it took us time to go ahead and recover from that. What Tom is doing now is the hard work to ensure that we target this right, that we begin the process of looking at it, and I think it's going to take us 6 months to a year to do that, how we would do that and have the least impact on the force, should those 4 assumptions all be true. But if they're not true, I've got to tell you, the Secretary of Defense has listened. He listened to the chief. The chief asked him to protect Army force structure to 15 and 16 to get us through the Afghan drawdown. He listened to the chief when the chief argued for the temporary end strength increase in order to get us over the loss of stop loss, and our last stop loss soldier will be out of the Army in March. And I think that the chief feels very strongly that if those assumptions are not met, that he can go back into the Secretary and talk to him about that 27K. I feel good about that. Have you tasked anyone to look at your chart of failed assumptions for the war in order to see if we can understand why and what weak signals we missed? My assumption is failed assumptions meant a larger war and cost lives. The failed assumptions I'm talking about in the failed assumptions chart is the one that says how many brigades we were going to have in Iraq and Afghanistan in every year. And there were about 5 different times when we said we were going to be down to 4 brigades. And in every single instance, I remember, and I give the chief a rough time about this, sitting when then Director of the Joint Staff, General George Casey, was briefing the ops steps. It was June of 2003, and he told us all that we'd be down to 4 brigades in Iraq by Christmas time. And I knew I was going to command the 1st Cavalry Division and figured that I would not be deploying. I give him a rough time about that because I saw him back over there about a year to the day later as we extended forces and brought more forces on. That is the failed assumptions chart that I speak of, and that's the one we've got to continue to watch. How will the Army change if the budget is reduced? I feel very, very good about how the systems that we've put in place. You know, people have heard me talk about this before, but I'll talk about it again. I think the capability portfolio review process that we began last January has paid significant benefits to the Army, significant benefits. We were able to find our $29 billion worth of efficiencies and go ahead and reinvest them into programs that they needed to be reinvested into. If you look at any other program except for air and missile defense, is a beautiful example that when we looked at all the different systems that we had in air and missile defense, it was clear to us that what we had was a whole bunch of programs that we were not going to be able to deliver on. We were putting a little bit of money against everything, and everything was costing us more. And the real sad part about it is that we were not investing money where we needed to invest money for the threat that was killing our soldiers on the battlefield today, and that was indirect artillery and rocket fire. So that when we took a look at that portfolio, when we downsized it, we reinvested that money into the systems that we needed and look to improve some of the systems that we had just recently brought on board to get at the air indirect fire and missile threat. We have a much, much more robust portfolio that will, in fact, serve the Army well. So I think the institutionalization of the capability for portfolio process in the Army is going to be huge. But I go back to my original comment. I think it's absolutely essential that we make sure that whatever Army we have, it's a balanced Army. And a balanced Army to me means an Army that's the right size, but that is equipped with the equipment that it needs. If we rob from either end of this thing, we're going to have huge problems in the end. And I fear if we try to protect force structure, if we can get to 1 to 3 and we can see that we can shed some force structure, if we try to protect that force structure, we may for a year or two, but then somebody will come back after we've robbed equipment accounts and go right after the force structure. The real key for us is convincing everyone that R4Gen provides a model which tells the National Command Authority that we are not unlike the other services. Whereas they will argue that we can't break the rotation of ships, of carriers, because we have to do the necessary maintenance on it. We have to do the same thing for our people. And that's what 1 to 3 means for us. We have got to change the dialogue so that people understand that if you're not going to provide a soldier 9 months on the ground and 27 months at home, or 12 months on the ground and 36 months at home, there are second and third order effects that you've got to accept. And for us, those are unacceptable. That has got to be our mantra, in my opinion. It says talk about GCV. I am excited about the GCV. I think we have learned our lessons. I think the last document that I was allowed to see was the RFP that went out. I think it was a good RFP. I think the entire Army was involved in that RFP. I think for the first time, and it's a second and third order effect of capability portfolio reviews, we have things like a tactical wheeled vehicle strategy, a combat vehicle strategy that grew out of the capability portfolio reviews that even Bob Lennox will come in here and tell you is affordable. And that's absolutely critical. And that's what we did with the GCV RFP. I talked about it when we were first discussing the GCV, that to me, and it's not because I'm a tanker, the M1, I'm not saying that GCV is an M1, the M1 is an example of where we want to get. A vehicle that came out in the early 80s, late 70s, has had incremental builds, a vehicle that is different today than it was when the first M1 and M1 IPs came out on the street. 120 millimeter gun, a commander's weapon station that we no longer said. That's where they ran out of money, you know, a commander's weapon station that makes that vehicle, each M1 SEP tank today, almost at least 1.5 to 2 tanks compared, and a platform that still shows great growth potential for the future. That's what we've got to have with the GCV. We need the capability packages. We need the ability to slim this vehicle down, or if we get into a direct fire, peer fight, kinetic fight, we need to be able to put the necessary passive armor until we come up with other solutions that we can integrate into this system. We need to put that passive armor on there that gives the crews the protection that we have been chasing throughout the 10 years of war we've been in. I always say it's much, much easier to talk about deployability on this side of the next war than it is once you get inside that war. Once you get inside that war, it becomes very, very important that soldiers have confidence that they can get in their piece of equipment and move from point A to point B and have a chance that they will make it to point B. And that's what we're doing with the GCV. And also a vehicle that we should have our first production model in 7 years, or really a little less than 7 years from now is the way I'm looking at it, hopefully. So I'm confident about GCV, but I'm more confident about our ability to put together a complete program, not just a GCV program. We've looked at the complete combat vehicle program and made a determination on what we can afford and are moving down that road. I'll ask the question that I wanted to ask. Tell me about what you're doing out at Fort Bliss. I think Fort Bliss is one of the most important things the United States Army has done in a long, long time. And I applaud the Chief for allowing us to do that. We have literally taken a brigade out of the rotation. We have dismantled the old AETF, that 1,000-person hybrid organization that we used to have. We've taken the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division. We've just about equipped them in a very, very short period of time with every single piece of equipment the United States Army has. They're going to have over 3,700 no-kidding soldiers in them. They're going to have the non-commissioned officers, the junior officers, the senior officers, and the soldiers, most of them, many of them from theater. And they're going to be assigned to this unit, and this unit is going to go on a 4-month test cycle. Their first one is in June, July time period, and they will literally test different pieces of equipment every 4 months. You know, we live in this bifurcated world, the world of what I consider an outdated acquisition system, a Cold War acquisition system that left to its own devices will take 10 years to pump something out. You know, if we were in charge of the Apple phone, we'd be 6 years away today from getting the first Apple iPhone out to anybody. That's how our system works. But at the same time, everybody applauds the ONS-JUONS system, you know, operational needs statement that come to the Army directly from its commanders, and then joint operational needs statements. They applaud that system, but the problem with that system that gets things to soldiers and commanders as quickly as they could possibly get it to them is many of the times we have not done even a modicum of testing or data collection to ensure that when it's put in the hands of that soldier, that it can be integrated in the formation and doesn't create more problems for the commander than it solves. It's kind of like capability portfolio reviews. If you isolate a certain thing, if you isolate APMI, or new mortar round, if you isolate Excalibur, if you isolate GCV, you'll get a totally different picture than if you look at GCV within the whole combat vehicle portfolio. What this organization, what this new AETF is going to do for us out at Fort Lewis is going to be, I think, going to have historic meaning in our ability to bridge these two systems, to take what industry has for us as they make technological leaps, to look at it, to see if it fits a no-kidding requirement, and then to send it to the AETF within a 4-month cycle and say, look at this, tell us, does this have value? Can you integrate it into our network? This to me is huge and something that has been missing. And I am really excited about what we are about to start out at Fort Bliss, Texas. Sir, I think I'm 5 minutes over. Since I'm out of cards, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today, and thank you so much for your service and all you're doing for the soldiers and families of the United States Army. Thank you, sir.